She wore white on the day she married the man who destroyed her family. She didn't know it then. She walked down that aisle with trembling hands and a heart full of grief and desperate hope, carrying the memory of her father like a wound that had never quite healed. She told herself this marriage was a second chance, a way out of the rubble of a life that had collapsed 3 years ago. She told herself that a powerful husband meant safety, stability, a future she could finally breathe inside. She had no idea she was walking toward the man who had pulled the trigger. And he looked at her from across that cathedral with dark, unreadable eyes, dressed in a suit that cost more than most men earned in a year, and he felt something he had not expected to feel. Not guilt, not recognition, something quieter and more dangerous than either of those things, something that curled inside his chest and refused to be named. His mother had chosen her. That was all he had been told. His mother had pointed at a photograph across a mahogany table and said, "This one," and he had not argued. He never argued with his mother. Not about this. But now, standing at the altar, watching this girl with the soft brown eyes and the barely concealed tremor in her bottom lip walk toward him, he understood that something was about to begin that he was not prepared for. He just didn't know yet that it would unravel everything. Her name was Sofia Moretti, and she had not chosen anything for herself since the night her father died. She was 23 years old when the story really begins, though the story had actually started long before she was aware of it, on a cold November night 3 years earlier, when she was still 20 and still believed that the worst thing that could happen to a person was a broken heart. She had been wrong about that, spectacularly, irreversibly wrong. Sofia had grown up in Naples, in a neighborhood that smelled of salt and oregano and old stone, in a house that was too small for 4 people, but had always felt exactly the right size when her father was in it. Marco Moretti was not a wealthy man. He was a bookkeeper, meticulous, quiet, with wire-rimmed glasses and soft hands that were more comfortable with ledgers than with anything else. He loved coffee. He loved old films. He loved Sofia with the kind of love that asks nothing in return and gives everything without thinking. Her mother had passed when Sofia was 12, and after that it had been just the two of them. Marco had learned to braid her hair, badly at first, and then eventually quite well. He had packed her school lunches with little folded notes inside. He had driven her to university on her first day and cried in the car on the way home, alone, where she couldn't see him. She had found out about the crying years later from their neighbor, and she had loved him even more fiercely for hiding it. Sofia was not naive about the world. She had grown up in Naples. She knew what certain men did for a living, knew the language of silence and debt and favors. But her father had kept all of that at a careful distance. Marco Moretti was clean. He had always been clean. That was what made it so impossible to understand when, 3 years ago, 2 men in expensive suits arrived at their front door, and her father went with them without even reaching for his coat. He never came home. The official story was a robbery, a mugging gone wrong in an alley 3 kilometers from their home. The police offered their condolences and a file number, and nothing else. Sofia had sat in the station with cold hands and burning eyes, and she had known, the way you know things in your bones even when your mind refuses to accept them, that the story was wrong. But she had nothing, no evidence, no connections, no power to push against whatever immovable wall stood between her and the truth. She had buried her father on a gray Tuesday and gone home to an empty house and made coffee in the way he had always liked it, strong and black, because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. And then, slowly, month by month, she had survived. She found work as an assistant at an accounting firm. She was good with numbers, like her father. She kept the apartment. She kept going. She did not let herself be pulled under, though there were nights when the water was very high. She had not been looking for rescue. That is important to understand. Sofia Moretti was not a woman sitting in a tower waiting for someone to climb it.
She was simply a woman trying to live inside the rubble of a grief she had never been able to explain or resolve. Which is exactly why when Donna Elena Valentini appeared in her life, she didn't see the danger hidden inside the kindness. Donna Elena Valentini was 71 years old and moved through the world as though it had been constructed specifically around her. She wore black, always black, though she had been a widow for over 2 decades, and she spoke in a voice like velvet over steel, low and cultured, and entirely accustomed to being obeyed. She was the matriarch of the Valentini family. That name required no explanation in certain circles across Italy and beyond. The Valentini family was old money that had grown darker and deeper over generations, wealth built on foundations that no one examined too closely, power maintained through a combination of political connection, financial muscle, and the particular kind of fear that came from knowing what the family was capable of when crossed. At the head of all of it sat Donna Elena's son. Luca Valentini was 32 years old. He had inherited his father's empire at 26 when his father, Don Pietro Valentini, was taken by a heart attack, the legitimate kind, though there were those who whispered otherwise. Luca had not expected to inherit so soon. He had been preparing, yes, men like him were always preparing, but there is a difference between knowing something is coming and it arriving. He stepped into his father's role with the calm efficiency of a surgeon and had not stepped back out. Under his leadership, the Valentini Empire had expanded. Cleaner operations, smarter alliances, less of the brutal, visible violence that marked his father's era. Luca preferred precision. He preferred the threat to the act. He preferred to sit across a table from his enemies and let the silence do the work. He was, by almost any measure, the most powerful man in Naples. He was also, by almost any measure, profoundly alone. This was not something he admitted to anyone. It was something his mother noticed the way mothers notice everything, quietly, completely, and with the particular patience of a woman who knew she was right. Donna Elena had been watching her son for years. She had watched him close himself off after his father died. She had watched the soft places in him harden one by one, like water turning to stone in a long winter. She had watched the women who circled him, beautiful, calculating, temporary, and she had watched him look through each of them as though they were made of glass. He needed something different, someone who was real. She had no idea she was walking toward the man who had pulled the trigger. And he looked at her from across that cathedral with dark, unreadable eyes, dressed in a suit that cost more than most men earned in a year, and he felt something he had not expected to feel. Not guilt, not recognition, something quieter and more dangerous than either of those things. Something that curled inside his chest and refused to be named. His mother had chosen her. That was all he had been told. His mother had pointed at a photograph across a mahogany table and said, "This one," and he had not argued. He never argued with his mother. Not about this. But now, standing at the altar, watching this girl with the soft brown eyes and the barely concealed tremor in her bottom lip walk toward him, he understood that something was about to begin that he was not prepared for. He just didn't know yet that it would unravel everything.
There was something in Sofia that Donna Elena recognized. A kind of quality, grief-tempered, unsentimental, fundamentally unimpressed by wealth or status, that was extraordinarily rare in the world Donna Elena occupied. The girl had looked at Donna Elena's house, the marble floors, the original paintings, the antique furniture, and had not flickered, not with envy, not with hunger, not with the particular performance of not reacting that wealthy people often noticed in those who were trying to impress them. She had simply looked and thought about the documents and answered questions directly. Donna Elena had offered her a coffee at the end of the meeting. Sofia had said yes, and in that hour, over espresso cups and a sitting room full of afternoon light, Donna Elena had made her decision. She had not told Luca everything when she proposed the arrangement. She had told him the girl was from Naples, good family, good character, no connections to any rival interests. She had told him it was time. She had handed in the photograph, Sophia, on a summer afternoon, not posed, not aware of the camera, laughing at something just out of frame with her head thrown back and her dark hair catching the light. Luca had looked at the photograph for a long time before he had said, "Fine." He had not asked questions. That was the thing about Luca Valentini. He trusted his mother's judgment in matters like this. He trusted very few people's judgment in anything, but his mother's, in matters of character, was something he had never doubted. What he didn't know, what neither of them had fully examined in the space between what was known and what was convenient to remember, was what linked these two people across 3 years and one cold November night. What he didn't know was that Sophia Moretti was the daughter of Marco Moretti, the bookkeeper. The bookkeeper who had, for reasons that still made Luca's jaw tighten when he thought about them, been in possession of evidence against the Valentini family 3 years ago. The bookkeeper who had been contacted by a rival faction and offered protection in exchange for what he knew. The bookkeeper who had ultimately been silenced before he could make a choice either way. Luca had given the order. He had been 29 years old, 3 years into leading the family, and a rival organization had been building a case against him using Marco Moretti's ledgers that showed money movements that in the wrong hands, in the wrong courtroom, could have dismantled everything his father had built. He had made the decision the way he made all difficult decisions, quickly, thoroughly, without flinching. He had not thought about Marco Moretti's daughter. He had not known there was a daughter, and now she was going to be his wife. Sophia had agreed to the arrangement for reasons that it felt, at the time, entirely rational. Donna Elena had been honest with her, or honest enough. She had not pretended the proposal was anything other than what it was, a structured arrangement between families, built on practical foundation rather than romantic feeling. She had told Sophia about Luca, not everything, of course, but the shape of him. Powerful, private, serious. A man who would provide security, protection, a life without financial fear. And Sophia, who had been living with financial fear and every other kind of fear for 3 years, had listened. She had not been swept away. She had sat across from Donna Elena in that same afternoon sitting room, and she had thought carefully about what her life looked like now and what it could look like in a different version. She had thought about her father, about how he had always wanted her to be safe, about how this was a kind of safety, even if it wasn't the kind either of them had imagined. She had also, if she was honest with herself, thought about the photograph Donna Elena had shown her of the man. Luca Valentini was not the kind of person you looked at and then stopped looking at. He was all dark edges and controlled stillness, the kind of face that suggested depths you couldn't see and weren't sure you wanted to reach. There was nothing soft about him in the photograph, but there was something that made Sophia's chest tighten in a way she hadn't expected and didn't particularly welcome. She had said yes. She had told herself it was practical. She had told herself she was being smart. And then the wedding day arrived, and she had stood in front of the mirror in a white dress that Donna Elena had paid for, and she had looked at herself and thought, my father would have hated this. Not this specific thing, not the dress, not the flowers, not even the man, but the circumstances, the calculation of it. Marco Moretti believed in love. He believed in it the way he believed in mathematics, as a fundamental truth underneath everything, invisible but structural. She had pressed her hand over her chest, pushed the thought down, and walked out to meet her future. The marriage was silent in the way that expensive things often are. Their home, one of several Valentini properties, a vast villa on the coast outside Naples, was full of space and light and the particular echoing quiet of rooms that had never been lived in comfortably. Sophia moved through it in the first weeks like someone learning a museum, careful not to touch too much, aware at every moment that nothing here was chosen by her. Luca was courteous, that was the word for it, courteous. He arrived at meals when he could. He spoke to her at dinner, not much, but not nothing. He asked about her day with the careful politeness of a man who had been taught manners before he had been taught warmth. He did not, in those first weeks, touch her. He moved around her with the particular deliberate distance of someone who was observing the terms of an agreement. Sophia told herself this was fine. She told herself this is what she had signed up for. but in the dark of the room she slept in alone, a room far too large with windows that looked out over the sea, she lay awake and felt the strangeness of her situation pressing down on her. She was in a mafia lord's house. She was his wife in name. She knew nothing about him. She knew nothing about the life she had agreed to walk into. And she missed her father with an intensity that sometimes felt physical, like something pressed against her ribs from the inside. She had brought one thing from her old life, a small framed photograph that lived on her bedside table. It was taken when she was 17, at a beach somewhere north of Naples, and she and her father were both squinting against the sun, laughing at something just out of frame with her head thrown back and her dark hair catching the light. She looked at that photograph every night before she slept, and she said without sound the things she couldn't say out loud. She had no idea that a photograph almost identical in feeling, her father's warm, slightly rumpled face caught in an ordinary moment, sat in a folder inside a safe in the study 2 floors below her. She had no idea what that folder contained. The first crack in the surface happened on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after the wedding. Sophia had been exploring the library. Luca had told her, in one of his brief, courteous ways, that she was free to use any room in the house, and she had found, between 2 volumes of Italian legal code, a thin book of poetry that felt loved. It was worn at the spine, and there were pencil marks in the margins, small annotations in cramped handwriting. She had stood in the afternoon light and read through them with a feeling she couldn't quite name, the sense of finding something private, something not intended for her eyes. She had brought it to dinner that night and placed it on the table between them. Luca looked at it, and something happened to his face, something small and fast that was there and then gone, like a door opened and immediately closed. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "The library. I'm sorry. I hope that's all right." "It's fine." He picked it up and held it for a moment, and Sophia watched his thumb trace the spine. "It was my father's," he said. "I hadn't expected that. I hadn't expected the softness that moved through his voice when he said it. Brief, completely controlled, but there, real." "Was he a reader?" she asked, because she didn't know what else to say. Luca looked at her across the table, and for the first time since she had met him, the look was not polite. It was assessing, like he was recalibrating something. "He was," he said. "He kept it hidden from his men. He thought poetry was—" He paused, the corner of his mouth doing something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same family, a liability. Sophia laughed, genuinely, without thinking, and then she was surprised by the sound of her own laughter in the large, quiet room, and she felt her face warm slightly. Luca was still looking at her. "Your father," he said then. "He passed recently?" The warmth left her instantly. She kept her face steady. 3 years ago." "I'm sorry." She nodded. "It was sudden." She looked down at her plate. I never really understood what happened. The police said it was a robbery, but..." She stopped. "Old habit. You didn't say things like that out loud. Not in Naples. Not when you knew the shape of things, even if you didn't know the details." Luca said nothing for a moment. "But," he said carefully. She looked up at him. His face was completely unreadable. "Nothing," she said. "It doesn't matter now." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. 4, 5. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose it doesn't."
He picked up his fork. They finished dinner in silence. But the silence was different now, charged with something that neither of them could have articulated, a current running under the surface of the room. Sophia lay awake that night for a very long time. She didn't know what drew her closer to him. She tried, in the weeks that followed, to analyze it the way she analyzed numbers, rationally, step by step, and she couldn't. It wasn't logical. He was not an easy man to be close to. He was complicated in the way that deep water is complicated, smooth on the surface and full of movement you couldn't see. But things shifted, gradually, without announcement. He started leaving books on her side of the breakfast table, poetry mostly, but also novels, Italian ones, one French one in English that she had to look words up for and loved anyway. He never commented on it. He would simply place the book there and say nothing, and she would pick it up and say nothing either, and somehow this became its own language. One evening she heard music coming from the east wing, a room she hadn't been in yet, and she had followed it without thinking, and she had found him at the piano. He didn't know she was there. She stood in the doorway and watched him play. Something classical, something she didn't know the name of, but it was full of feeling that she recognized, the kind that couldn't be said and so had to be played. She had stood there for 4 minutes before a floorboard betrayed her, and he stopped. He had looked at her over his shoulder with the expression of a man who had been caught doing something private. She had not apologized. She had sat down in the chair by the window and said, "Please don't stop." He had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had turned back to the piano and played for another 20 minutes, and she had sat in the blue evening light and felt something move through her chest that she was deeply reluctant to give a name to. She was, she realized with a kind of exhausted inevitability, falling. She didn't want to be. She had not come here for this. She had come for safety, for stability, for the mechanical comfort of a structured life. She had not come here to feel things, not for a man like this, a man who lived in shadow, a man whose hands had signed who knew what in who knew which offices of power and violence. But the heart, as her father used to say, is not a department that takes instructions from management. And Luca Valentini, the man she saw in the quiet hours, the one who played piano alone and kept his dead father's poetry book with its penciled margins, was not the man she had expected to find. There were things she began to notice that she didn't allow herself to think about too carefully. The scar on her left hand, curved between thumb and forefinger from something he had never mentioned. The way he dismissed the 2 men who followed him everywhere when he was at home, wanting, she sensed, to be off duty from his own life. The fact that he woke early, she could hear him sometimes, 2 in the morning, moving through the house, and she wondered what kept him from sleep, what lived in the hours between midnight and dawn for a man who had done what Luca Valentini had done. She didn't ask, not yet. They had arrived in those weeks at something tentative and unspoken, a beginning, the kind that both people feel, but neither person is willing to say out loud, because saying it would mean it could be taken away. Was Luca who broke the careful distance first. It happened on a night when there had been trouble. She didn't know the details, and he didn't offer them, but he had come home late, and something in him was wound tight, drawn back like a bow, and she had found him in the kitchen at midnight, standing in front of the open refrigerator, like a man who had forgotten why he opened it. She had sat down at the kitchen island and said, "Do you want me to make you something?" He had looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen him before, stripped down, off guard, too tired for whatever performance he normally maintained. He had sat down across from her, and she had made pasta, badly because she was a mediocre cook and they both knew it, and they had eaten it at midnight in the kitchen with no staff around and no formality, and he had laughed at the pasta, a real laugh, low and genuine and surprised out of him. And she had felt it land somewhere in the center of her sternum like something landing home. Afterward, when she got up to take the dishes to the sink, he had reached across the counter and touched the back of her hand. Just 2 fingers, barely a touch, a question with no words in it. She had stood very still and felt the whole world balance on that moment. She had turned her hand over, slowly, and his fingers had closed around hers. Nothing else, just that. They stood in the kitchen in the middle of the night, holding hands over empty pasta bowls, and something was sealed between them in the silence. Something real, something neither of them had planned. Sophia looked at the small framed photo in her mind, her father, squinting at the sun, and she felt for the first time in 3 years something other than grief. She felt afraid of how much she might lose. His name was Carmine, and he was Luca's second in command, and he was the one who made the mistake. Sophia had been at the family estate on the mainland for a visit. Donna Elena had invited her for an afternoon, and they had been building, quietly, their own relationship. Donna Elena was not warm in the conventional sense. She was sharp and demanding and occasionally frightening. But she was also, in her way, extraordinarily kind to Sophia, the kind that came from genuine respect. She could feel it, even if she didn't fully understand it. She was leaving the estate, walking through the long gallery hall towards the door, when she heard voices from the study. She would have walked past, she was walking past, but she heard her name, her full name, Sophia Moretti. And then another name spoken in the same breath, in a way that linked them, Marco Moretti. She stopped. She stood in the hallway, 3 feet from the closed study door, and the voice on the other side, Carmine's voice, she recognized it, was speaking in the low, clipped tones of a man giving a report. She doesn't know, obviously, but someone will talk eventually. People in that neighborhood remember. If it gets back to her. Another voice cut him off. Luca's voice, flat and final. That's enough. Boss, I'm just saying, if she ever finds out that her father was... I said, enough. A pause. Long enough to swallow everything. Yes, sir. Footsteps approaching the door. Sophia moved. She was around the corner before the door opened, pressed against the wall, her heart beating so hard she was certain it could be heard. She stood there perfectly still while the footsteps passed and faded down the corridor, and she waited until the house was quiet again. And then she stood in the hallway alone with what she had heard, and she felt the world she had been carefully building in the last 2 months begin, very quietly, to crack. If she ever finds out that her father was...
Was what? She drove home in silence, hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, and the whole drive she turned the sentence over and over in her head like a stone, looking at every side of it, and she could not land anywhere good. Any ending to that sentence that she could imagine led somewhere she could not stand to be. She did not tell Luca what she had heard. She went home and looked at her father's photograph and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time in the dark. She started looking. She was an accountant's daughter who had grown up learning to trace numbers, to find the thing beneath the thing, to follow a thread wherever it led. She had those skills, buried under 3 years of grief and survival, and she pulled them out now. She accessed property records. She accessed court filings that were publicly available. She pulled old news articles, buried deep, the kind that didn't make front pages, the kind that appeared briefly and were then absorbed into the general hum of criminal life in Naples. She spent 3 weeks doing this slowly, carefully, at the public library and never on any device inside the Valentini house. And piece by piece, she began to reconstruct it. Her father had been employed, briefly and unknowingly, by a shell company linked to the Valentini organization, as a bookkeeper. He had been brought in to tidy up financial records that his employer had described vaguely as belonging to a private investment firm. He had been diligent, methodical. He had found irregularities. He had noted them the way he noted everything, precisely and completely. What he hadn't known was that those irregularities were evidence of money movements that would have buried the Valentini family had they reached the wrong eyes. He had been approached by a rival faction. This part was hazy, reconstructed from fragments, who had wanted him to testify, to cooperate, to provide what he had seen. And he had. She found this in the wreckage of the fragments, and it destroyed her. Refused. Her father had refused to become a weapon in someone else's war. He had told them he would not cooperate. He had said he wanted nothing to do with any of it and intended to simply be done with the whole business and walk away. He had never gotten the chance to walk away. The order had been given before he could. She found the name at the bottom of everything, in a deposition from a sealed case that had somehow leaked into the public record 4 years ago before it was scrubbed. Not fully scrubbed, as it turned out, because someone had archived it on a legal watchdog site that the Valentini lawyers had apparently never found. The order was issued by the acting head of the Valentini organization, identified in transcripts as LV. She sat in the library with the printout in her hands and felt the ground open up beneath her. LV. Luca Valentini. Her husband. She was very calm on the drive home. This was the thing that frightened her most in retrospect. How calm she was. How completely the emotion had shut down, as if her nervous system had taken one look at what she was carrying and decided it was simply too heavy to feel. She walked into the house. She walked upstairs. She stood in front of the mirror in her room, the one she had stood in front of on her wedding day,
and she looked at her own face. White dress, she thought. She had worn white. She went to the bedside table. She picked up her father's photograph. She held it in both hands and stood there, and the calm cracked, and then it shattered completely, and she slid to the floor and pressed the photograph against her chest and made a sound she had never heard from herself before, raw and terrible, coming up from somewhere below language, below reason, from the place that had been waiting to scream 3 years. She cried until there was nothing left, until she was empty. And then she got up off the floor because Marco Moretti had not raised someone who stayed on the floor. She washed her face. She put the photograph face down on the table. She sat on the edge of the bed and she thought, clearly, without emotion, the way her father had taught her to think through problems, about what she knew and what she didn't know and what she was going to do. She knew what he had done. She knew the shape of it. What she didn't know was the reason. What she didn't know was whether there was more. What she didn't know was whether the man who had played piano in the empty room and touched the back of her hand over empty pasta bowls and placed poetry books on her breakfast table, whether that man had known who she was when he married her, whether this was something worse than what she had found, whether she had been brought here deliberately as some kind of... She couldn't finish the thought. She needed to hear it from him. She found him in the study. He was at his desk. When she looked up and saw her face, he went very still. She closed the door behind her. She crossed the room and stood in front of his desk, and she put the printout down in front of him, the archived deposition, the transcripts with the initials, and she watched his face. She watched him look at it. She watched whatever remained of his composure face what was in front of him, and she watched him close his eyes for 1 second, then open them, and she saw in those eyes something she had never seen in them before. She was a woman who had spent 2 months learning to read this man, and what she read in his face in this moment was not defiance, and not dismissal, and not any of the things she had steeled herself for. It was something that looked, in a man who never looked like anything, devastatingly like grief. "You knew who I was," she said. Her voice was level. She had practiced it on the stairs. "No." He said it immediately, quietly. "I did not know who you were when we married, I swear that." "When did you find out?" A pause, a beat too long. 3 weeks after the wedding. Carmine found the connection in a background check that should have been done before. 3 weeks. He had known for 6 weeks. He had held her hand in the kitchen. He had placed books on her table. He knew. "And you said nothing." The level voice cracked on the last word, just once, just slightly. He stood up. He moved around the desk, not towards her, just around it, and he stopped a few feet away, and you could see the effort it cost him to stay at that distance. You could see he wanted to close the gap, and you could see him not doing it. "I wanted to tell you. Every day since I found out, I wanted to, don't." She took a step back. "Don't tell me what you wanted. Tell me what you did. Tell me why my father is dead, Luca. Tell me that." The room was completely silent. He told her. Not all of it at once. It came out haltingly, in the clipped way of a man who did not speak about difficult things, had trained himself not to, now dismantling that training piece by piece in real time. He told her about the ledgers, about the rival organization, about the threat to the family, about the order. And then he told her something she hadn't found in the printout, something that shifted the unbearable weight of it just slightly, not relieving it, not excusing it, but adding one piece that changed the shape of everything. "He was told that your father had agreed to cooperate, that he had already given information to our enemies, that it was done. I was told that by the man who handled the matter, a man I trusted, who was working at the time, I later discovered, for the very people he claimed your father was helping." She stared at him. "I was lied to," he said. It was not a plea. He said it plainly, a fact being laid down beside other facts, not as defense, but as truth. "I have known this for 2 years. I had your father's situation re-examined after I found out who you were. He refused to cooperate. He was going to walk away. He was never a threat. The order should never have been given." The silence stretched. "That doesn't bring him back," she said. "No," he said. That That doesn't make any of this. She pressed her mouth against her own, held herself together, felt the whole weight of 3 years pressing from both sides. He was my father, she said, and her voice broke completely. He was the only person I had, and he left me alone, and I couldn't understand why. And I've been alone for 3 years, and I married you thinking... She couldn't finish. Luca took a step towards her and she put her hand out to stop him. And he stopped. He stood there, and she saw something happen in him that she had never seen in him before. Something that looked, in a man who never looked like anything, devastatingly like grief. I know what I took from you. She turned away from him. She walked to the window and stood there looking out to the sea, and the sea was dark and moving and enormous. And she stood there for a long time while he didn't speak and she didn't speak. And then she said, to the window, to the sea, to her father who could not hear, "What am I supposed to do with this?" He said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She left the house the next morning.
She packed a single bag, the way you pack when you're not sure if you're packing forever or packing for a week. And she went to a small hotel in the old part of Naples, and she sat in a room with peeling wallpaper and a view of a narrow street, and she thought about her father. She thought about him for 3 days straight. She thought about his hands on a steering wheel. She thought about the note he left in her lunch on the last day of school before winter break in her second year of university, which she still had, which she had kept in the pocket of a coat she never wore anymore because she couldn't let go of it. She thought about the last time she saw him. They had argued about something stupid, about her forgetting to call when she said she would. And she thought about how the last thing she had felt toward him was mild irritation, and how she would give every single day she had left to have that argument again. She thought about Luca Valentini. She thought about that with a different quality of attention, fiercer, more conflicted, full of things that fought with each other, rage and grief, and underneath both of those, something she was furious at herself for, something that would not stop. Something that remembered the piano in the dark, and the hand over empty pasta bowls, and the way he had looked at her photograph with grief in his eyes. On the 3rd day, Donna Elena came. Sophia had not expected her. She had not told anyone where she was staying. She opened the door of her small hotel room to find Luca's mother standing in the narrow hallway in black, as always, with the posture of a queen and the face of a woman who had been through more than Sophia could imagine. "May I come in?" she asked. Sophia stepped back. Donna Elena sat down and looked at Sophia with steady, dark eyes that were, Sophia realized, red at the edges. She had been crying. This woman who moved through the world like marble had been crying. "I need to tell you something," Donna Elena said quietly. "Something Luca doesn't know I know." Sophia sat down across from her. "I knew your father's name," Donna Elena said quietly. "Not immediately, not at first, but by the time I chose you, by the time I placed your photograph in front of my son, I had come to understand who you were." She folded her hands in her lap. "I want you to know that I did not choose you as punishment for him. I did not choose you as penance." "Then why?" Sophia said. "Because I have been living with what happened to your father for 3 years. I did not give the order, I was not consulted, but I am the head of this family, and what this family does is my responsibility. I have carried that." She paused. "And I chose you because I watched you for 45 minutes in my sitting room, and I saw what you were made of. I saw the grief in you, grief just like mine, grief that has no place to land, and I saw strength. And I thought," her voice tightened just once, just briefly, "I thought that if my son could know you, truly know you, it might do something to him that nothing else had done." She stared at her. "Did you think," Sophia said carefully, "that I had a right to know? That I had a right to choose?" "Yes," Donna Elena said simply, "and I failed in that. I failed you, and I am asking you to hear it." The silence between them was very full. Donna Elena continued, "Luca did not know who you were when he agreed. Whatever he has done, and I do not minimize it, he did not bring you here knowing. And from the moment he found out,
It has destroyed him from the inside. I have watched my son for 6 weeks, and I have watched a man trying to find a way to deserve something he knows he doesn't deserve." Sophia looked at the window, the narrow street, 2 children running over the cobblestones, laughing. "He can't undo it," she said. "No," said Donna Elena, "he cannot. And I can't simply—" "No one is asking you to simply do anything." Donna Elena leaned forward slightly. "I am asking you to take whatever time you need. I am asking you not to make a decision in the middle of the wound. And I am asking you because I believe you deserve to know that the man who gave Luca false information about your father, the man who was actually responsible for what happened, was found 2 years ago." Sophia looked at her. "He answered for it, fully. That is all I will say about that." She stayed in the hotel for another week. She did not see Luca during that week, but she received on the 4th day a single envelope, no note inside, just the archived deposition she had left on his desk, and behind it a thick set of documents. His own private investigation into her father's death. 2 years of work, every detail, the exposure of the man who had lied to him, the evidence of Marco Moretti's refusal to cooperate, a sworn account, signed by 3 witnesses she had never met, of the moment her father had told the men from the rival faction that he would not be their weapon. Her father, in his last days, had protected the family he didn't even know had ordered his death. She read that and held the paper in shaking hands and cried again, but differently this time. Not only grief, not only rage, but something more complex and more human than either. The particular kind of sorrow that comes from understanding that a person was exactly who you believed them to be, even at the end. Her father had been good. He had been exactly as good as she remembered. She folded the papers carefully. She put them in her bag, next to the photograph. She came back on a Thursday. She came back in the evening when the house was full of the amber light that fell across the marble floors in the hour before dark. She let herself in and stood in the entrance hall, and it was quiet, and she stood there for a moment, just breathing. She found him in the piano room. He was not playing. He was just sitting on the bench, his back to the door, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed. He looked like a man at the end of something, like a man who had been waiting in a specific kind of stillness that was not peace. She stood in the doorway. He heard her. She knew because of the way his body changed, just slightly, just the set of his shoulders, just the fraction of breath. He didn't turn around. "I can't forgive you today," she said. Her voice was steady. It had cost her a great deal to make it steady, but it was. "I know," he said. "I may not be able to forgive you at all. I don't know yet. That isn't a door I can open from the outside. I can't decide to open it. It either opens or it doesn't." "I know," he said again. "But I know what my father would have said," she continued. "He would have said that the worst thing you can do with grief is let it close you. He believed that. He believed it even after my mother died. She stopped, pressed forward through it. "He would have been furious with me if I let this make me someone who closes." Luca was very still. She crossed the room. She sat down beside him on the bench, close but not touching, and she looked at her own hands for a moment. "I have questions, a lot of them, and you're going to answer them, all of them, for as long as it takes, whenever I ask." "Yes," he said. "And this, whatever this is, it's not going to be easy. Not going to be anything like easy. No. But I'm not going to run from something because it's not easy. That's not who I am." She felt him look at her. She felt it before she saw it, and when she turned her head, his eyes were on her, and they were stripped bare in a way she had never seen them, in a way that she suspected no one had ever seen them. He didn't say anything for a long time, and then he said quietly, with the specific care of a man who is speaking a truth that has cost him everything to arrive at, "I don't know how to be the man you deserve. I don't know if I can be, but I would like," his voice impossibly was unsteady, "I would like to spend whatever time you give me trying to figure out how." She looked at him. She thought about her father, She thought about the note in her coat pocket. She thought about Marco Moretti standing up in front of men who could destroy him and refusing to become a weapon because that was not who he was. She reached out and placed her hand over his, the scarred one, the left one, the one with the curved mark between thumb and forefinger that she had never asked about. She covered it completely. He looked down at their hands, and she saw something move through him that was enormous and quiet, like a tectonic shift, like something giving way underground. "Play something," she said. He looked at her. "Play something again," she said softly. "I want to hear what you play when you think no one's listening." He turned to the piano. The first note fell into the silence of the room and rose and opened into something that was, she realized, not classical, not formal, not composed by anyone else. It was his, entirely his, halting at first, and then, bar by bar, finding its shape. Something raw and searching and full of the particular quality of a man who had lived a long time in the dark and had, somehow, unexpectedly, found a window. She sat beside him and she listened. Outside, the sea moved against the shore, patient and enormous, indifferent to the small, terrible, beautiful things that happened in the houses above it. Inside, two people who should never have found each other, who had been brought together by loss and deception and the inscrutable mathematics of consequence, sat in the amber light and held, very carefully, the beginning of something. Not forgiveness, not yet, not easily, not quickly, not without cost. Something more honest than forgiveness, something that looked at the full weight of what had happened, all the darkness of it, the grief of it, the irreversibility of it, and chose, in full knowledge, to remain. The months that followed were not simple. They were not a montage of tenderness. There were nights when Sophia lay